Andi Madison Wagner was born on June 9, 1998, and was described as a very giving individual with a kind heart. When Andi was around 18 years old, her mother, Elaine Garcia, moved to Texas to get away from Evansville. She tried to convince Andi to come with her, but she wanted to remain close to her father, sister, and grandparents. Unfortunately, by 2022, 24-year-old Andi had gotten in with a bad crowd and developed a drug addiction. When she lived at her grandparents' house, she was rarely there and often stayed with friends around Evansville and nearby cities. Seeing the struggle her daughter was going through, Elaine invited her to come live with her in Texas, and she agreed. She told Andi that she was coming to town for her other daughter's 21st birthday, and she could ride back with her. Unfortunately, 2 weeks before the move was set to take place, she sadly disappeared. On August 6, 2022, Andi unexpectedly returned to her grandparents, packed a bag, and left about 10 minutes later, but never told them or her sister where she was going. After leaving, they would sadly never see her again. The last communication was a text her family received later that day. At 8:30 p.m., Andi was spotted 40 minutes away in Oakland City, where she was known to frequent. It wasn't unusual for her to spend days away from her grandparents' house, but they said she always kept in touch. By August 12th, when they had still not heard from her, they reported her missing. Once investigators were involved, they quickly put together a list of 11 people who may have had knowledge of her whereabouts, but sadly it never led to Andi. One of those people was allegedly her ex-boyfriend. Elaine, desperate to find her daughter, moved back to Evansville to help search. In October 2023, she searched the basement of an abandoned home in Evansville and found some clothes that she believed belonged to her daughter, but it still didn't lead to her whereabouts. Elaine has theorized that someone was mad about her moving to Texas and killed her because of it. There's also the possibility that she overdosed and her body was disposed of. It's also not out of the possibility that she was forced into sex trafficking. In May 2024, the FBI received a tip regarding 3 locations. One of those locations that was searched by investigators was a property in Gibson County, Indiana, where they seized some large bags of evidence. Sadly, on December 18, 2023, due to the mental stress of Andi's disappearance, Elaine passed away without ever finding out the truth. It's now been almost 2 years since Andi was last seen, and as of June 2024, she has not been found, and this case remains unsolved. Joseph Schuyler Burnley was born on October 18, 1985, and went by the nickname Sky. In high school, he was a standout baseball player, but unfortunately, he had a habit of popping pills. After graduating, he ended up in jail after being caught at the Neshoba County Fair with 5 Xanax on him. He was convicted of a felony and sent to the now-closed Walnut Grove Correctional Facility, about an hour northeast of Jackson, Mississippi. However, by 2016, 27-year-old Sky had allegedly gotten his life back on track. He had gotten back into reading his Bible and going to church. He and his girlfriend even got saved together at the Hickory Ridge Baptist Church. It seemed on the surface that his life was finally heading in the right direction. That is, until 2016, when everything came crashing down. On June 2, 2016, Sky left his grandmother's home where he lived and left his Bible open to Joshua 1:9, which read, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." There was also a note to his girlfriend, Sydney, on his bedstand that basically talked about his love for her and that he would see her again one day. He also asked her to help people take the right path. It was as if he knew he was never coming home that day. That night, he stayed at the home of his friends, Travis Brewer and Amanda Morris. The following day, on June 3rd, all 3 of them, along with Travis and Amanda's 4-year-old daughter, allegedly went out looking for Travis's 1988 Chevy pickup truck, which had been stolen by a man they knew by the name of Matthew McCoy, along with his cell phone, which had been inside. That morning, at 9:48 a.m., surveillance footage from a gas station captured Sky coming in and buying something. After leaving the store, they tracked Travis's phone to some woods outside of Brandon, Mississippi. Once there, Amanda and her daughter stayed with the truck, while Travis and Sky allegedly split up to search for the truck. However, when Travis returned, he was alone, and according to them, Sky was nowhere to be found. At that point, they claimed the heat was unbearable and were ready to leave. I checked the weather that day, and the high was only 88 degrees, not exactly a hot day in Mississippi. They claimed they tried yelling for Sky, but received no answer. After waiting for a little bit, they decided to leave without him. Sadly, Sky was never seen again. By June 4th at 1 a.m., when there was still no sign of him, they called 911 and reported him missing. He also told the 911 operator that he had since found his stolen truck along the road. He said it had been damaged and the cell phone was still missing. The cell phone was found days later, just feet from Travis's front yard. This area is nowhere near where they were searching. This also poked a hole in their story because they claimed to have tracked the phone to Brandon, Mississippi. It's worth noting that when Matthew McCoy was charged with the theft, he was asked about the cell phone. He told investigators he threw it out the window after stealing the truck. If that's true, that means the whole story about tracking Travis's phone to Brandon, Mississippi was a lie. After reporting Sky missing, Travis went to Sky's uncle's house and left a note on the door that read, "Travis, Sky's friend, he is missing. I'm worried something bad has happened." After Sky's disappearance, some have said that due to the letter he left his girlfriend, he might have taken off. However, his family doesn't believe that and said he often left notes and Bible verses for Sydney to help remind her of the religious journey they were on. So what really happened to Sky that day? His mother, Stacy Humble, said that while Sky was in jail, he was forced against his will to join the street gang called the Simon City Royals. One of the gang members who knew Sky called Stacy after he went missing and alluded to his disappearance being related to the gang. Basically, once you are a member, even if it is in jail, you are always a member. His family believes he was trying to get out of the gang and become an informant. Because of that, they believe a hit was put out on him. Interestingly, Travis and Amanda were arrested on misdemeanor drug charges. Officers also found drugs at their home in Pearl, Mississippi. They then told officers that all three of them were involved in the sale of drugs. Travis also told them that on the day they were out looking for the truck, he and Sky used meth. While Amanda passed her polygraph, Travis failed his, especially when he was asked what had happened to Sky. Travis is now the prime suspect, and they believe he is lying about the events that took place on the day Sky went missing. They are also treating his disappearance as a probable homicide and believe it all connects back to the Simon City Royals. As for what happened on the day he disappeared, investigators believe he was lured into the woods and murdered. They later learned that Sky allegedly stole some drugs from a dealer and that his murder might have been in retaliation. Sadly, as of 2024, Sky has not been found, and this case remains unsolved. Melissa Sue Flores was born on December 21, 1979. In 2006, 26-year-old Melissa was a divorced mother of 3 children, living with her off-and-on-again boyfriend, Ronnie Dean Denny Jr., who was also the father of her youngest child. Unfortunately, the relationship at times was very tumultuous due to Denny being a drug dealer and living a very high-risk lifestyle. He even threatened to shoot her in the face in July of 2006. Scared for her life, she took out an order of protection against him. However, a week later, the two had reconciled, and she asked the court to dismiss the order. By January 2007, she had discovered he was also seeing a childhood friend of his by the name of Shannon Long after catching them in the act. Once they realized they were seeing the same man, they decided to hang out together to teach Denny a lesson. On January 26, Melissa and Shannon went to a party where they met 2 men. All the while, Denny was pissed and continued blowing up both their phones. Around 5 a.m. the following morning, they end up back at Shannon's house. Once there, she said Melissa grabbed her stuff and left, saying she was headed to get her kids. Now remember that 4 people at Shannon's house saw her drive away because this will be important later. Around 8 a.m., she called her sister-in-law and said she had been asleep at Ronnie's house and would be by to get the kids around 11 a.m., but strangely, she never showed up. Her sister-in-law began calling Melissa to see what was going on, but never received an answer. At that point, family members decided to pay Denny a visit to find out what was going on. When they arrived, they found her vehicle there with her purse and cell phone still inside, but there was no sign of Melissa. At that point, they reported her missing. 6 days later, Denny was arrested on drug and weapons charges. However, for those charges, he only received a suspended sentence. A few years later, Jason Canterbury, a former friend of Denny's, came forward and told police that Denny confessed to murdering Melissa. He said that he and Denny were driving around one night when Denny pulled off to the side of the road and said, and I quote, "You want to hear the truth?" Jason said no, but he continued anyway. He said he began crying and said, "I did it. I killed her. I killed Melissa." He said that when she arrived at his house on the morning of January 27th, the two got into an argument, and he grabbed his black 9mm rifle and shot her twice with it. The argument was allegedly over Denny accusing Melissa of cheating on him. Another man also came forward and said he witnessed the shooting and called his brother Russell Davis to come help clean up the crime scene. They put her in a trunk and put it in Denny's Nissan Pathfinder and drove it out to an abandoned farm where they buried it under some brush. They then drove around, throwing the murder weapon, a 9mm rifle, into 2 different bodies of water. Unfortunately, the police have never been able to recover Melissa's remains or the murder weapon. While Denny denied the allegation, investigators would later find 2 bullet holes in his former rental home. However, Denny's family says they were told by investigators that the trajectory of those bullet holes would have required a person to be 10 feet tall. The bullets that created those holes ended up in the neighbor's home. They were able to recover one of the bullets, and it matched a 9mm rifle, the same type of gun witnesses claim Denny used as the murder weapon. Interestingly, when Shannon was asked about the bullet holes, she said she wasn't surprised they were in the house because, according to her, Denny had somewhere close to 50 guns. A third-party ballistics expert was brought in by the show Reasonable Doubt and proved that the person having to be 10 feet tall was simply not true, and that the trajectory could match Denny's height if he was standing near the door to his room. He also said that the bullets that hit the wall would not have gone through Melissa. However, I read that Denny allegedly shot at least 1 warning at Melissa before murdering her. It's also possible the bullet holes were created before Melissa was murdered, considering there were 50 guns in the house and there was constant drinking and drug use. Regardless, it doesn't rule Denny out. Let's go back to Shannon for a moment, because Denny's family claims that investigators found blood in her home on her sheets, but never investigated her as a potential suspect. Shannon was asked about the blood and said she was having sex with one of the men after Melissa left and her nose ring got pulled out. Plus, remember that 4 people saw Melissa leave her house that night, and Melissa's own sister-in-law spoke with her 3 hours later when she said she was at Denny's house. Denny's family also said they didn't believe the witnesses were credible. However, an eyewitness expert found Russell Davis's testimony credible, except for the part where they buried the trunk. Even though he implicated himself, it's possible he knew finding the body would be worse for everyone involved and lied about the location, or like I said earlier, Denny or maybe even Russell moved the body. The last piece of incriminating evidence is that neighbors saw Melissa's car in Denny's driveway that morning, but later that afternoon, they saw him push it out to the road. In June 2014, with all this evidence in hand, Denny was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. By that time, he was married and had started a new life in Texas. In September 2015, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Unfortunately, the only thing preventing this case from being officially closed is Melissa's body. I know this case could easily be considered solved, but until her body is found, it remains open. To this day, Denny's family continues to believe he was wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. Rachel Louise Cooke was born to parents Robert and Janet in Georgetown, Texas, on May 10, 1982. In 2002, 19-year-old Rachel was a student at Mesa Junior College in San Diego, California, with plans to transfer to a college in Los Angeles, California, to study fashion design. She was on the school's cross-country team, and as part of her training, she would run 4 miles every morning. When she traveled back to her parents' home in Georgetown for her cousin's wedding, she wanted to keep her training going. On January 10, 2002, Rachel made plans with her father to go shopping, but she also wanted to get her 4-mile run in. Her parents left for work around 8 a.m. Then around 9 a.m., Rachel's boyfriend back in San Diego called her and woke her up. She told him she was going to get up and go for her daily run and would call him afterward. About 30 minutes later, she headed out into the North Lake subdivision, but would tragically never return. When her father, Robert, arrived home at 3 a.m., he found it strange that Rachel wasn't there, but her purse and cell phone were. Worried, he called her best friend to find out if she had seen her, but unfortunately she hadn't. As the hours passed, they grew more concerned and began searching for her. They started by calling a restaurant called Wildfire, where she was known to work when she came back into town. Whoever they talked to at the restaurant gave them wrong information and said she had worked that night. Feeling a sense of relief, they waited, expecting her to show up any minute, but she never did. By the next morning, they called the restaurant again and realized the employee was talking about another Rachel who also worked there. At that point, they went through her belongings and realized that the only thing missing was her running shoes. So Robert went driving around searching for her while Janet went to the local hospital. When those attempts failed to find Rachel, they both went to the sheriff's department and reported her missing. Officers immediately dismissed her disappearance as nothing more than a young girl who was off partying somewhere. The officer even had the audacity to say that she probably was in Mexico with her boyfriend. Right, she traveled 1,300 miles back home, leaving her boyfriend in San Diego, only to meet up with him and go to Mexico. The closest crossing into Mexico from Georgetown, Texas, is over 4 hours away. From San Diego, it's only about 30 minutes. It makes zero sense why the officer would think she would travel all the way to Texas and then go to Mexico when she could easily go to Mexico from San Diego. On Saturday, January 13, 2002, with no help from officers, they organized a search themselves. However, an investigator showed up around noon and stopped the search, worried that volunteers might be destroying a potential crime scene. Finally, by Sunday, Texas Ranger Matthew Lindeman arrived to help. Thankfully, Lindeman knew Rachel had not left on her own. That same day, another search was organized involving EquiSearch, but sadly, no sign of her was found. Upon questioning neighbors, they discovered that 6 people had seen Rachel running that day, with one couple seeing her at the end of her run between 11 and 11:30 a.m., only about 200 yards from her parents' home. There were multiple men spotted in the neighborhood that day, and their sketches were released to the public in hopes investigators could question them. Neighbors also reported seeing 2 males in a late model white Chevrolet Camaro suspiciously circling the neighborhood. They had even seen Rachel near the car at one point, and then saw one of the males in the back of the car wrestling with what they thought was a female. They eventually tracked down the Camaro and discovered it was just 2 teens who had skipped school that day and found no evidence they were linked to Rachel's disappearance. At that point, they turned their attention to her father, Robert, and he agreed to take a polygraph exam. He only failed one question: "Do you know where your daughter is?" While it is not certain why he failed that question, Robert explained that he believed his daughter was dead and in heaven. He was ultimately ruled out. Rachel's boyfriend also flew back to town and was questioned by police. Since they could prove that the phone call between him and Rachel on the morning she disappeared was made from San Diego, he was ruled out as well. Her family then told investigators about a volatile relationship she had with an ex-boyfriend. When she broke off the relationship, he was pissed. The previous month, when she came in for Christmas, the ex showed up at her parents' house, drunk, at 3 a.m, pounding on the door. Janet threatened to call the sheriff on him, and he eventually left. 2 days before she disappeared, she had an encounter with him at a local party. He was drunk and confessing his love for her, which eventually turned into an altercation. However, he denied being involved, and they had no physical proof to tie him to her disappearance. 4 years later, in August of 2006, a man by the name of Michael Keith Moore, who was in prison for murdering a pregnant woman, confessed to murdering Rachel. He said he saw her jogging and decided to abduct her. After knocking her unconscious, he drove her to an unknown location, sexually assaulted her, and then killed her with a hammer. Afterward, he dumped her body in the Matagorda Bay. His confession seemed so legit that investigators felt they had the right man. He He even drove a white truck, which witnesses had seen in the neighborhood that day. In November 2006, he was given a plea deal that required him to plead guilty, and a court date was set. However, before he accepted the plea deal, he recanted his confession and said he made the entire story up in order to get preferential treatment. The charges against him were ultimately dropped. On January 27, 2011, he agreed to be interviewed for a true crime episode regarding Rachel's disappearance. But when they brought him in for the interview, he changed his mind. Interestingly, before he was convicted of murder, he lived only about 12 miles from the Cooke family home. Rachel's family now believes that Moore was simply taking advantage of their daughter's disappearance for his own gain. Sadly, her father passed away in November 2014 without ever learning what happened to his daughter. Unfortunately, it's now been over 20 years since Rachel went missing, and as of 2024, this case remains unsolved. Deborah Darlene Hunter, a native of Boone County, West Virginia, got involved with a very violent individual. In 2012, they went on vacation in Florida, and while there, he sexually assaulted her. Some sites reported that it wasn't just a vacation and that they actually moved to Florida. Regardless, after being sexually assaulted, she reported the incident to the police, and he was subsequently arrested and charged. She then traveled back to Charleston, West Virginia, and began staying at the Sojourners Women's Shelter in Charleston. After a few months, the man was released from jail and returned to West Virginia. On July 2, 2012, he was able to track her down at the shelter. After being seen with him that day, she was never seen again. That same day, a witness came forward, claiming to have seen her in Madison, West Virginia, about 30 miles south of Charleston. Once the shelter realized she hadn't been there in about a week, they contacted her family, who in turn called the police and reported her missing. Unfortunately, it would be another 4 years before her case was entered into NamUs. The man she was involved with before moving back to West Virginia immediately became a person of interest. After Deborah went missing, her case unfortunately fell through the cracks. Once investigators rediscovered the case, they were able to track down a woman that the man dated after Deborah's disappearance. She told police that he had confessed to killing a previous girlfriend of his, but never gave her a name. That woman fled to Texas to get away from him. When investigators reached back out to her in Texas, she refused to talk. Unfortunately, the man's name has not been released to the public. If Deborah were alive today, she would be 56 years old, but as of June 2024, she has not been found, and this case remains unsolved.